Today, we're at the Howard Zinn Book Fair at Mission High School in San Francisco, and I'm speaking with Jesse Hagopian. Jesse just made a presentation about his new book, which is titled More Than a Score, The New Uprising Against High-Stakes Testing. That's a topic Jesse knows well because he was one of the leaders of a standardized test boycott at Garfield High School in Seattle, where he teaches history. The boycott gained national attention in 2013 and helped spark a national movement against high-stakes standardized testing. Jesse is also an associate editor of Rethinking Schools magazine and a founding member of Social Equality Educators. Jesse Hagopian, welcome to Flashpoints, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Right on. Thanks for having me today.
All right. Can you start by telling us just a little bit more about what's important to know about you and the social justice work that you have been doing recently?
Yeah, I graduated from Garfield High School in the 90s, and I left as a student who had been humiliated by high-stakes tests that showed me I wasn't intelligent. And it wasn't until I found some professors in college that remade the purpose of education and show me that the power that it could have in explaining forms of oppression that I had faced and how to organize and contribute to social movements, that I started taking school seriously and saw that you could have education outside of the bubble or the bubble test, and made me want to be an educator and contribute to that. And so coming back, I have the privilege to now teach at my alma mater at Garfield High School, and our movement has been absolutely breathtaking to see my colleagues stand up with dignity to represent their profession and say, we actually understand education better than billionaires who have never been to public schools, who don't send their kids to public schools, and we want to reclaim this profession. We want to implement best practices in pedagogy and assessment, and we want the corporate education reformers out of the way. And the staff at Garfield High School, and I think educators across Seattle and across the country, are beginning to take up that fight in an unprecedented way.
The fight that you've led at Garfield has been inspiring for people in the Bay Area and all over. I wonder if you can just tell us, for those listeners who don't know, tell us the story of what happened at Garfield High in 2013.
Yeah, so I got a phone call from a teacher, a highly revered teacher named Mallory Clark, who's our reading teacher. She often takes kids well below grade level entering high school, sometimes third grade reading level, and gets them to standard reading level at high school level, sometimes within a year of work. And her renowned work made her a really effective leader in this fight. But she gave me a call and said, I need to meet with you after school. And I went and met with her, and she told me that she was going to refuse to give the MAP test, the Measures of Academic Progress, computerized, standardized test that she felt was a complete waste of time, right? She has a method for raising her kids' reading level, and the MAP test was actually detracting from the instructional time she had. She told me, if I want to know how well a kid reads, I'm going to have him read a book, right? I don't have to have him sit down at a computer and humiliate him with a score that the computer spits out. I can have him read different leveled books. And she was no longer willing to lose the class time she needed to do her job. And so we began talking to other teachers in all the departments, and uniformly the teachers thought this was a complete waste of time, that this test that was being used to evaluate teachers wasn't even aligned to our curriculum. So the math teacher told us, he teaches ninth grade algebra, but he's seeing geometry questions on the test, which would be like if a Spanish teacher saw French questions on the test, right? It's a foreign language, but it's a completely different subject. And he felt the test was outrageous for not being aligned to the curriculum. As a social studies teacher, what bothered me about the test was seeing our computer lab shut down for weeks at a time, 3 times a year, to administer this test, because it meant that our largest computer lab is in our library, and so our library is shut down, so I can't assign research projects, and the kids don't have access to check out books for an intolerable amount of time. And the English language learners talked about how This test was humiliating students who were trying to learn English as a second language, and on and on. So we held a all-school staff meeting, and we discussed these problems and more with the test, and we decided that it was time to take action. You know, teachers asked me what could happen if we do this action, and I told them I couldn't sugarcoat it, that in fact you could be reprimanded, suspended without pay, or even terminated if you refuse to administer this test. And I don't want to shock anybody, but those were not the words that inspired the MAP test boycott. That was a real consequence that was scary for the teachers in the room to contemplate. But another teacher, an incredible educator named Karen Gunn, a math teacher, stood up and said, "I'm tired of hearing about this test, labeling our kids failures, labeling teachers. I'd rather be reprimanded for standing up for what I believe in than just letting this test run over us." And at that point, we took the vote, and it was unanimous, save a couple abstentions. And that launched the MAP test boycott. We called a press conference in a second-floor language arts room and announced to the media and to the world that we were no longer willing to have our profession degraded by a second-rate assessment. And we were quickly threatened with a 10-day suspension without pay by our superintendent. But the student body government voted unanimously to support us. The PTA voted unanimously to support us, and thousands of emails and letters and authors sending us books and flowers and chocolates from all over the country came pouring into Garfield High School and kept our resolve up. We quickly realized that this fight wasn't just a fight at Garfield High School. It wasn't just a fight against the MAP test. This was a fight to redefine education, and educators and parents across the country were tired of this high-stakes testing regime that rolled in with No Child Left Behind, was put on steroids with the Race to the Top program, and now the Common Core state standards tests, that people just had enough. And the stand that we took at Garfield High School, ultimately, not only did they not suspend us, but they canceled the test for high schools at the end of the year, seeing the size and scope of our movement and knowing that we weren't going to back down. And it just spread throughout the country. That spring of 2013, commentators dubbed the education spring. And we saw walkouts against high-stakes tests by students in Portland, in Chicago, in Colorado, and huge opt-out movements of parents in Long Island erupt, and it hasn't slowed since.
Your opposition originally at Garfield High was to that particular version of the standardized test. But now we're seeing not just a particular test, but the whole issue of high-stakes testing and the question of the Common Core, which is a standardized curriculum. Let me ask you, first of all, the dominant corporate narrative about these things is that this is about actually helping students by holding schools and teachers accountable. And you've already critiqued the problem with that, but what do you think is really behind that propaganda? What's really driving that agenda to have such massive standardized testing and curriculum?
Yeah. There's a few ways to understand how the corporate education reformers, or as I call them in my book, the testocracy, how to know that they're completely disingenuous. In fact, they're not interested in holding schools accountable to raise achievement levels for all students and to create a rich and empowering education for all our kids. And here's one way you know that, because I often have said that the MAP boycott really didn't start at Garfield. In fact, you could say it started at Lakeside High School, where Bill Gates went to high school, where his kids go to high school, because they never gave the MAP test at that school, and they don't give any of these high-stakes standardized tests at that school. What did they do for Bill Gates' kids? They fill the library with tens of thousands of volumes. They inundate the school with the arts, performing arts, and music. They have study abroad programs for the kids there, and they don't want the kids sitting down filling in bubbles because they want to train these kids to be creative, to be leaders, to be thoughtful on the problems of the day so that they will be running society. And we want the very same for our own students. I think these high-stakes standardized tests are really about regimenting knowledge, about training kids to believe that wisdom is the ability to eliminate wrong answer choices from a prescribed list that coincidentally they get to decide, right? And that trains you very well to be in a low-wage job where you take orders. And I think that ultimately these tests are really about destabilizing the teaching profession, right? Having your profession and your job tied to a test score means that the union can no longer protect you. And, then you can label teachers as failures and you can fire them. And that's very useful for busting the last major national union. The biggest unions left are the teachers' unions. And so we've seen that the high-stakes tests are really the lifeblood of this corporate reform movement. How do you close massive amount of schools like they did in Chicago? You label them failures with the tests and you close them, right? How do you deny kids graduation and funnel them into a school-to-prison pipeline? You have high-stakes exit exams for high school. And so this is really the outcomes of their tests, and our movement is about reclaiming education for a much higher purpose and saying you cannot reduce the intellectual and emotional activity of teaching and learning to a single score.
Mm-hmm. Well said. Can you say a little bit more about the Common Core? Because I think a lot of people understand the problem with standardized testing. The Common Core has been a little more controversial, where even some progressive educators feel like it possibly is a step forward. There's at least some talk of critical thinking. So what's the problem with the Common Core?
Well, in some states, the Common Core could actually replace some flawed standards, especially where teachers are forced to do scripted curriculums and read off the page what they are supposed to instruct the students with. The Common Core can open up some space in those particularly flawed places, but teachers in Washington State look at the Common Core and it looks pretty similar to some of the standards that we have in Washington State. But it also has some dramatic blind spots, some horrible, I think, aspects to it that limit knowledge and limit what good pedagogy is. And I think the reason why it has such blind spots is because educators weren't consulted in the creation of the Common Core standards. Bill Gates spent $200 million to strong-arm these standards on states, develop them, and then bribe government officials to adopt these. And educators were left out of the creation, and parents were left out of the creation of these standards. So you got testing company moguls who got to help design them, and textbook company executives and representatives. But when you leave out educators, you get the product that we have, which I think has a couple basic limitations. I think one, it's completely developmentally inappropriate for the earlier grades. My son just started kindergarten, and when you look at the goal of career and college ready being forced down on the early grades, it's absolutely ludicrous. I don't want my kid to be career or college ready at the kindergarten level. I want him to know how to be a good person, how to interact with his classmates and treat people well. And I think the goal of having them read at that early age is not developmentally appropriate. They also are pushing out literature. There's a huge increase in what they call informational texts. And Alma Flor Ada, who's a renowned children's author, has a great chapter in my book about the power of literature and how it's critical to self-exploration and to developing the whole person. And I think they don't want literature because reading a whole book is superfluous to the testocracy, because what they are interested in is reading passages that can be turned into test questions, right? And then you can quantify knowledge. And these are severe limitations of the test. And then just the last thing, and the worst part about it, is the high stakes test that comes shrink wrapped with the standards, right? The Smarter Balance and the Park assessments are, again, just the same old A, B, C, D bubble tests that are ranking and sorting our youth.
Right, and then once you've got the standardized curriculum, then that's just open door for any type of standardized test for big publishing companies, the software companies, just paves the way, basically, right?
That's right. There's this incredible quote from Bill Gates where he explains the purpose of Common Core in a candid moment, and he says, when the tests are aligned to the common standards, the curriculum will line up as well, and that will unleash powerful market forces in the service of better teaching. For the first time, there will be a large base of customers eager to buy products that can help every kid learn and every teacher get better. And you see, to Bill Gates, the purpose of the Common Core is to create customers who will buy products. And that's really not why any of us got into the teaching profession.
And that's straight from the horse's mouth. Can you tell the story about Rhode Island?
The Providence Student Union is an incredible act of resistance that flowered in that first education spring. And the students there organized a zombie march down to the Department of Education's with blood-splattered clothes and green face paint to demonstrate what these tests were doing to their brains. And it captured the media's attention, and I think really helped to show that students were tired of being dehumanized by these tests. And they went on to organize an incredible event which had the adults take the test. So they got their hands on a copy of one of the tests, and they held a forum where they brought together professionals, lawyers and doctors, and had them take this graduation requirement test, and then a couple weeks later held a press conference to announce the scores. And as it turned out, 60% of these professionals did not pass the test, wouldn't have graduated, right? So I guess they aren't career and college ready, and it just exposed the lie that these tests are an arbiter of success in our society. And in fact, their ongoing efforts led to the state legislature suspending the high stakes for testing in their state, and it was a huge victory.
That is such a great story. You started to address that one of the key pieces of the corporate education agenda is to break teachers' unions. Again, there the narrative is the problem with education is bad teachers. Bad teachers are protected by unions who only care about their members, not the students. And the union busting has been a primary front of the corporate education agenda. So what do you think about that narrative? What's really behind that?
Yeah, I want to read one more quote from my book, I think, to really help us understand how this is about union busting. It's, addresses the Common Core state standards, and it's Edward B. Russ Jr., Chairman and CEO of State Farm Insurance Company, whose statement appears on the Common Core website. He says, "State-by-state adoption of these standards is an important step towards maintaining our country's competitive edge. With a skilled and prepared workforce, the business community will be better prepared to face the challenges of the international marketplace." So you can see that the 1% in this country see education as a tool to help them compete in the global marketplace, not as a way to empower our youth to solve problems that they face in their community, but as a way to line their pockets and compete internationally. And to the corporate education reformers, the testocracy, the 1%, they see busting the teachers' unions in America as critical to their project of building their wealth, right? They have destroyed most of the unions in this nation over the last 30 years. And the NEA, the National Education Association, and then the American Federation of Teachers are the largest the largest unions at all in America. And I think critical to the success of the business elite in the United States is defeating China in international competition. And they actually want to create a low-wage workforce in America that can compete with the low-wage workers of China. And I think to do that, they have to erase unions altogether in this country. You see Boeing in Seattle moving production down to the south, right, where there aren't unions. And you're seeing more and more production being moved to the south and right to work states. And so I think, tying our professions to test scores, trying to eliminate tenure and instead use value-added measures to assess teachers has nothing to do with the quality of teaching and learning, but really about busting teachers' unions. Even the American Statistical Association came out and said that value-added testing is junk science, that it has no bearing on the quality of the teacher. A teacher who's shown to add value one year has a 25 to 50% chance of showing negative value the following year, right? So it's statistically an invalid measure, but yet it's being used because it's a convenient tool to destabilize the teaching profession and bust unions.
Now, within the unions, there is some struggle about to what extent to collaborate or resist or build alliances for a different vision of education. Where are some of the places where we've seen the strongest social justice movement within unions? Can you give us a couple of examples?
Well, I take a great inspiration from the Chicago's Teachers Union and their 2012 strike that pushed back the corporate education behemoth. And Karen Lewis has an incredible chapter in the book describing her history with taking standardized tests as a kid up through her graduate career and how she developed her beliefs that led her to, as the president of the Chicago Teachers Union, fight back against high-stakes testing. Another example is St. Paul, Minnesota, and Mary Catherine Ricker, who's the president of the St. Paul Federation of Teachers, has a breathtaking, inspiring chapter in the book where she explains how she helped organize her union to fight back against attaching the state test to the teachers' evaluations. And it actually was in state law that the state test has to be tied to teacher evaluations. And so she went to the bargaining table with her district and was attempting to bargain an illegal contract because she knew that this test wasn't a good arbiter of teaching and learning and that it was going to erode the quality of education. And when I asked her, what do you say to folks who charge that this is preposterous, how could you possibly think about bargaining a contract that's illegal? She said, thank goodness Frederick Douglass didn't care what was legal or not during slavery, that he stood up and fought, right? And she said, took inspiration from union movement throughout history to say, we have to do what's right for our kids, regardless of the flawed laws state to state. And I think that's a model that we need to look at around the country, and union leaders need to stand up much more forthrightly and defend the last public institution that serves everyone for free.
What does it mean to you to be a social justice educator or a supporter of social justice education? How would you define that?
I think that you have to redefine the purpose of education. The corporate education reformers have said that the purpose of education is to be career and college ready. And to me, to reduce education to that is to strip it of all of its power. And I think that, in fact, education has to have a far bigger purpose because we face incredible challenges in our society today. We have more black people behind bars today on probation or parole than were slaves on plantations in 1850. That's a social catastrophe that education should be about organizing young people to understand that problem and equip them with the skills to solve that problem, right? That's social justice education to me. We have the greatest income inequality in U.S. history right now, where 85 people have as much wealth as the bottom 3.5 billion people on the planet. That is a crisis that's causing all sorts of other problems in our society, and the crushing poverty is destroying people's lives. And education should be about empowering students to reclaim the wealth that they're going to be producing as low-wage workers in our society. And I think that the greatest challenge we face overall is the fight against climate change, because if we can't stop the temperature from rising 2 degrees in the next 30 years, then we face the possibility of extinction as a human race. And I think that education has to be about developing collaborative skills with our students, leadership skills, helping to unlock their imagination, and giving them, I think, the tools of civic courage to be able to tackle the challenges we face today. And that's what I think social justice education is all about.
Beautifully said. So what do you believe is then most important for supporters of social justice education to be doing now, wherever they're located, whether they're educators or parents of students or community members who support social justice education? What would we hope to see people doing?
Yeah, I think starting with an education piece that can draw people together. Do a showing of the new film Standardized that describes the destructive nature of these high-stakes tests, or start a study group around a chapter in More Than the Score, or a Rethinking Schools book called Pencils Down, and discuss what the problems are with high-stakes testing, what the alternatives can be to high-stakes testing. Educate your community about this issue, and then find a action that you can take collectively. Maybe the teachers at your school or the parents at your school are ready to launch a boycott of one of the high-stakes tests, right? Maybe you can hold a zombie march in your own community, or have the adults take the test like they did in Providence, Rhode Island. Something that will draw attention to how these tests are eroding public education, and organize it collectively. And I think you'll be surprised at how many people come to your aid and express solidarity with your struggle.
Mm-hmm. Nice. How can people learn more about some of the key movements for social justice education, or particularly around high-stakes testing?
Well, I'm an associate editor for Rethinking Schools, and I think it's one of the premier journals, magazines that really on a day in, day out basis collects some of the best practices in pedagogy for social justice teaching in the classroom, and also has some of the most important stories about collective action against the corporate reform movement. And so I would recommend people check out Rethinking Schools magazine. Get a subscription to that. I think More Than a Score has incredible stories of resistance from parents, students, teachers, administrators. Hearing from superintendents who are fighting against high-stakes testing is really heartening. And so, check out these great resources that we have, and then go get active.
What makes you most concerned about the future of education, and what makes you most hopeful?
I think the thing that makes me most concerned about the future of public education is the complete silencing of educators that's going on in the media, so that the people who have the most knowledge about what it takes to run the school and to deliver quality pedagogy and engage students are the last people consulted about education policy. So you have Time magazine running a front page cover story called Rotten Apples, all about why we need to bust teachers' unions, and completely silence the voices of educators who believe that we actually are professionals and have a lot to say about pedagogy, about why we need unions and basic workplace protections. And that side of the story is left out all too often of the corporate media. But I think what isn't so inspiring to me is that we are currently experiencing the largest revolt against high-stakes testing in U.S. history. There are more people engaged in collective acts of resistance to reclaim our schools from the testocracy than have ever occurred in our past. There were 60,000 families that opted their students out of high-stakes exams in New York State last spring alone. There were teachers who launched boycotts of high-stakes tests in Chicago and New York. And just 2 days ago, I think perhaps the biggest walkout against high-stakes tests by students in U.S. history occurred in Colorado, with hundreds or thousands of students skipping the state-required science and history exams. And I think we're at the very beginning of a process where more and more people are joining this movement to take it back from the corporate reformers.
Anything else you want to address that I didn't ask you about?
Yeah, I just want to say that teachers aren't against testing. We actually invented testing, and we rely on different forms of assessment to help us understand where our students are and what the next step in their development can be. It's just that the standardized assessments created by corporations like Pearson, who are creating these to profit, not to actually gain good assessments of our students, are really a second-rate form of assessment. And we advocate for performance-based assessments that actually allow the students to explain their thinking, right? And the idea is very similar to what happens when you get your PhD. At that level, they want you to be able to think. So they don't have you fill in bubbles or eliminate wrong answer choices. That doesn't tell a professor if you really understand a subject. And so they have you do research over time, develop a thesis, and then present your research and your thesis to a panel of experts. And that's exactly what they do at schools like the New York Consortium schools in New York State, where they have some 28 schools that have exemptions from the high-stakes tests, and instead they ask their students to present their research to experts. They bring in journalists from the community, scientists, and so that all the subjects are covered, and the students find that the tests are not a time away from learning, but actually one of the biggest growth experiences they have at the end of a semester, engaging in a dialogue with someone in that profession who can push their thinking further. And these schools have higher graduation rates, better college attendance rates, and I think really should serve as a model for the power of quality assessment.
All right, so our guest today has been Jesse Hagopian. He's a history teacher at Garfield High School in Seattle, an associate editor of Rethinking School magazines, a founding member of Social Equality Educators, and we really encourage listeners to check out his new book, More Than a Score, The New Uprising Against High-Stakes Testing. Jesse, thank you so much for sharing your insight, your wisdom, and your inspiration.
Right on, man. Thanks a lot for having me on the show today.